So it's impossible not to notice all the nostalgia for the early 2000s, but that nostalgia feels fake to me. I don't remember the early 2000s as this glorious time. It was dark and kind of uneasy. Today on the podcast, a new book confronts the darkness of the early 2000s. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. All right, maybe we will begin by taking you back to, a simpler, more innocent time.
And that's about the time she walked away from me. Nobody likes you when you're 23. And I'm still more amused by TV shows. What the hell is ADD? My friends say I should act my age. What's my age again? What's my age again?
All right, I'll give you that. That is a good bit of nostalgia. It is kind of hard not to be confronted by the nostalgia of Y2K right now, the golden age of pop punk, of rom-coms, of, TV shows hosted by Regis. If you go on TikTok, you'll find countless videos with the Y2K hashtag, and they celebrate the music and the film and the fashion of that era, although I'm not sure what fashion there was to actually celebrate. But there's a new book by our next guest that paints a somewhat less rosy picture of that time. It's called New Millennium Boyz, and it's a debut novel by Vancouver writer Alex Kazemi. And it tells us a very dark coming-of-age story that reminds us that Y2K was also the time of Columbine, the time of Marilyn Manson, the time of the Woodstock 99 riots. And it also suggests that this era that TikTokers love to romanticize, it planted the seeds for toxic masculinity and online hostility that we see today. It's a wild read. It's the rare book that got slapped by a content warning by its publisher. I was really excited to speak with Alex about his book earlier this week. Here's our conversation. Alex, what's good, man?
Oh, dude, what a sick intro. Thank you so much.
Of course. My pleasure. I'm excited that you're here. I'm excited to talk about this. So let's talk about the two main characters of your novel, what they're going through.
Well, they're two teenage boys who are kind of trying to navigate different parts of Y2K. So Brad is really into pop punk. Lou is really into the darker, more satanic, goth-driven culture, but their camaraderie is driven by the claustrophobia of being a teenage boy in suburbia with all of this marketing from mass consumerism, MTV, and they're just really trying to figure out who they are as young men versus what the media is trying to tell them who they are.
I remember this period of time because this is the period of time that I moved to Canada from Sudan. Wow. So I was born in Sudan. I moved to Canada when I was 12 in the year 2000. And right, it's as you can imagine, it's a bit of a culture shock, but also was maybe a greater culture shock is the figures that I was introduced to guide me through the journey of like what it is to be a young person in this country. Mm-hmm. Where like they're all metalheads. So like the first music that I listened to was like Disturbed. That was like the first band that I loved. You know, someone like Marilyn Manson. So there's an ethos and an era in this particular period of time that we don't really like to think about very much. That seems to have sort of gone by the wayside. Why do you think we don't like to return to that period very much?
Well, I think because it makes people uncomfortable with the reality and the freedoms that people had back then culturally. And obviously with our current political climate, people romanticize this freedom. But like what I argue in the book, this kind of like edgelord dialogue is actually really myopic and it just sounds like white noise and it really doesn't really add anything into the culture. So I'm sort of exposing this false freedom that we thought we had back then was actually a prison in itself.
So these two main characters, Brad and Lucif, they're meant to represent two sides of your own psyche. Is this like a Tyler Durden sort of Fight Club situation?
Well, my psyche or the collective culture psyche, just seeing like the different type of young boys that I grew up around. And the book is a lot about the private and public self, right? Boys have their own private worlds and we don't really discuss that a lot in art. We're always talking about the cruelty of teenage girls, but we don't really ever explore what boys are going through. And then we get all shocked when they're internalizing all of this pain and trauma. And then there's a big event that is their way of trying to portray their pain to their friends and adolescents or adolescent friends and things like that. And I mean, I guess as a teenager, I did have anger and pain and stuff like that. But I was more so trying to explore the psyches of things like the Columbine killers as well.
Mm-hmm. Calling this book dangerous, which you did not do, but other people are calling the book dangerous. That puts you in a certain kind of conversation, puts you in a kind of sort of tension. Do you think your book is dangerous in any kind of way? Like, do you think it's dangerous to return to these ideas that did in fact exist in the early 2000s?
I would hope that most people would read this book as a critique and not a celebration of the things that I'm discussing. And I don't know if I really believe in this idea of dangerous literature, because there's been so many forefathers before me, you know, Bryson Ellis, Chuck Palahniuk, Dennis Cooper, you know, a lot of queer artists like who have always explored these subversive themes. So the idea that something in our kind of censorship culture could be considered dangerous has more so to do with how people are choosing to consume the work versus what it is. I mean, is a book dangerous? I don't know.
Something about the idea of a book being dangerous, I think goes hand in hand with maybe demanding morality from art in a way that maybe we didn't demand the same kind of morality from art, 20 years ago. And you could make art about relatively messy people. You can make art about people who are actually not necessarily even worthy of moral redemption, but they have an interesting story. And it feels like we've kind of moved away from that in a way.
You make a really good point. I think that that's what's actually dangerous is moral art, ignoring the fact about like works that ignore human contradiction, the dark side of human nature. It creates this facade and it ignores reality, and it creates this kind of historical revision. And I think the Y2K nostalgia culture is really about historical revision. People just want to hold on to this feeling of, oh, I felt so warm watching Much Music and seeing Ed the Sock, and I felt so warm and life had so much order back then. But there was also so much violence and darkness in the underbelly, like the racist attacks in my book. Like that came up in a lot of my research. That was a thing, you know?
Yeah. This novel tells a story of teens in the year 1999. Dude, it is not your adolescence. You were 6 in 1999.
Yeah.
What is it about Y2K that you want to keep returning to?
Well, I think because when I started the book when I was 18, we were indoctrinated with Tumblr. It was the Tumblr generation. We were constantly inundated with Y2K teen movies, Y2K references, and there was this like dreamlike feeling that was ephemeral about, oh, if it was Y2K, I would have been happier. Or 1999, I would have had more friends or things like that. And I saw that as a common conversation on Tumblr. Yeah. And then, I decided to sort of delve into the Columbine tragedy and try to empathize with it and try to understand what was going on in the psyches of the boys. And then so the book just sort of was formed out of a bunch of strange teenage interests. Mm-hmm. But definitely Y2K I chose was because I wanted to have a mission to unmask this mania of Y2K nostalgia and obsession and reveal a true documentary reality of that period.
You got a novel that opens with a pretty interesting dedication. The dedication is for anyone in this world who was born a boy. What did you mean by that? I mean that there is a particular underlying specific feeling of what it's like to be born a boy and be a teenage boy. And I hope that the book reflected and mirrored those strange feelings, whether it was hormonal, alienated, and also just figuring out how to navigate what it means to be a young man in the world. Mm-hmm. And what do you see as sort of the biggest challenges that boys face growing up?
I think that a lot of the internalization of having to always stay strong and not speak about the darker aspects of your emotions, or kind of when you do, everything is sort of like a sardonic joke, amongst your buddies. And I guess also just all of the media inundation, really, just like the images of what it means to be a boy in pornography, in film, in music and art, and trying to navigate who you are amongst all of that messaging and figuring it out, while also, feeling included, because at that age, feeling excluded is one of the worst feelings, right? Yeah.
You brought up Columbine, and it immediately made me think of the Michael Moore documentary, which for me, Bowling for Columbine, like that was
inspo.
That was right. I mean, that was a significant turning point for my youth, and one of the most transformative moments. I remember the electricity of the feeling going through me as I was watching this documentary. And then at a certain moment, Michael Moore puts the question to Marilyn Manson, who at the time was being blamed for the massacre. And he says, "What would you have said to these boys?" And Marilyn Manson takes a long pause, and then he looks at the camera and he says, "I wouldn't have said anything. I would have listened." And I remember that being like, "Oh my God!" Like, you know, like that feels like this like big profound moment. And then you kind of fast forward to now, and we are in this large reframing of Marilyn Manson as a figure when it comes to his treatment of women, when it comes to a bunch of sexual assault allegations. What do you make of the turn of how we view Marilyn Manson then and now as kind of like an explanatory figure in a way in terms of the journey that we've taken?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that he was always sort of honest about who he was in his darkness, like in that era. And we weren't kind of really looking at maybe the real violence and harm that he was causing to people. I mean, he talks about it openly in the book, Long Hard Road Out of Hell, and everyone owned that book, you know, and it was on everyone's bookshelves. And then as soon as these stories started to come out, everyone started to piece everything together. I think it's a sad story because I think that there was a very real productive aspect of his art in the 90s and in Y2K in allowing people who felt alienated, queer, different, a space to feel like they relate to a person. And also that he's externalizing these darker emotions of the shadow self and the psyche like we've been talking about. But I think the rewriting of Marilyn Manson more has to do with he's accountable for that. You know, he shouldn't have done those things.
Yeah. The question, I think, becomes, you know, when we consider your book in the context of the larger conversations that we're trying to have about Boyhood, about reframing of this early 2000s nostalgia is how do you have an open and honest conversation about the plight of being a teenage boy that you mentioned, the anger, the alienation that exists, without tipping the scale into, you know, handing the microphone over to like an Andrew Tate kind of figure to become the spokesperson for that kind of plight.
Someone like Andrew Tate is like a vampire to that adolescent vulnerability. These boys are confused. They're trying to figure out what it means to be a man. They're upset about third wave feminism. They're upset about social justice. They have this weird idyllic idea of what being a man means, and the internet sort of encourages them to access their worst impulses, you know, like romantic way of that era, what I'm talking about. But how we have these conversations, I mean, it's tricky. You know, I would hope that things like art can elicit bigger conversations like this book, and more work like it. But I would hope that I think it's good that we're talking about mental health, and Gen Z is more self-aware about men's mental health and all of these type of things. But in a way, you have to be very careful because men are very like sensitive and fragile about it. You know, they don't want to feel like their masculinity is being broken as we discuss these topics.
That description of tricky is exactly right, because the worry, right, is that you hand over the reins to someone who is an edgelord, right? Like someone who's like interested in stirring those darker elements of people's souls in service of something actually darker, as opposed to the service of, hey, that darkness exists within you. How do you process it or come to understand yourself? And it's a very careful calibration. I would say the way that people are talking about this book, this is the calibration. How do you approach trying to get that right without sort of dipping into edgelord territory? Like
as an artist?
Yeah, as an artist.
Well, I guess, you know, obviously I'm playing with fire and I'm revealing really real artistic, real documentary reality type moments that we try to like forget about or believe are unseen. But I guess that is, it's sort of inescapable. You know what I mean? It's like I'm going, if I'm persecuted by certain people who choose to read the text differently, but all I can do is try to educate people about my point of view about the book, which is that this is a reprimanding of the culture and it's not a celebration. And that if I were to celebrate it, I would be a completely different person or a different artist. And it's not something, this is not like Harmony Korine art bro drag. You know, I really do care about the issues that I'm talking about in the book, which is why I got a blurb from Brooks Brown, the Columbine survivor, you know, who was friends with Eric and Dylan, because, you know, I wanted people to know that this is a very well researched and honest portrayal of Y2K adolescence.
I think what you've done is brave as hell, because it seemed like for maybe 2 decades, no one is really interested in opening this particular
Pandora's
path,
box.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you've done this. I am so interested in the conversations that your book ends up creating. That is obviously going to be in the next little while to come. But Alex Kazemi, in the meantime, it's been a delight. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, dude. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Loved it.
That was my conversation with Vancouver author Alex Kazemi. We were speaking about his debut novel, New Millennium Boyz, which is out now. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud. You're listening to Commotion. All right, take a listen to this.
I know London. People pay a lot of money to get high out there. You want to have a mindset to get to the top. You have to fight for what you want. If we do this, we're unstoppable.
That is a bit of the trailer for Netflix's acclaimed crime drama Top Boy. It is set in a fictional neighborhood in London. The series centers on a couple of childhood friends. We've got Sully and Duchesne. They're navigating friendship, money, power, and betrayal. And also, they're trying to maintain their growing illegal drugs empire. This is a UK series that has a massive following in Canada and in the US. Netflix just put out the final season of the show last week. Ian Steaman is a longtime Top Boy fan. He's watched it. We talked about it yesterday. Here's our conversation. Ian, what's good, dude?
Hey, good to be back.
Okay, so there was all this anticipation in the lead up to this final season of Top Boy. The anticipation was big. Was the new season worth the wait?
I think that really depends on where you sit in the Top Boy universe. I think fans are a little upset that the show is ending.
Yeah.
I think they're probably also a little upset that this was the shortest season of the 3 that Netflix produced. And I don't want to get into spoiler alerts, but the chances of the show returning in any way, shape, or form in the way fans love about it is slim.
Oh no! That's it's not spoiler, but it's ominous. I'll tell you that.
It's very ominous. The ending of the show is very ominous. That is a good way to put it.
There's a big old ominous vibe in terms of everything that you just said. How do you feel about that ending? How do you feel about it?
I think there was an air of inevitability about how it all kind of culminated. This is a show set in the crime world, street world, drug dealers. There's a lot of treachery, violence, vying for power. Those things and being in that world have a lot of consequences, and the show explored those consequences.
So I was out with a friend the other day, and he was like, look, man, I got to go home because I'm doing a Top Boy rewatch before the new season comes out. And I was like, what's happening? Like, I understand that this is not a show that is particularly on my radar, but the following that it has in North America, or in the UK and North America, is like, it's basically cult level at this point. What do you think it is about the show that has made it so resonant with audiences?
Well, first of all, I will say I did the same thing that your friend did. I mean, the last season only came out last year. So it wasn't that long ago, but I felt like I had to go back and kind of go through it and get myself set up to watch this final season as well.
Yeah.
Listen, Top Boy taps into a template or a blueprint that a lot of these shows kind of follow. If The Wire is the Levi's 501 of crime dramas, every show is built off of that kind of silhouette or that template.
Yeah.
There's an element of mystique and intrigue about that world. People are curious about it. It's a world that's closed off to the rest of us that don't, that are not about that life. And here's a completely fresh new spin. I mean, the Powers, the Wires, and the Snowfalls, they're all set in North America or the U.S. specifically. Yeah. Here's a show that explores that world in a completely different country. So even if they use a lot of the same tropes that these previous shows have kind of explored or told their stories through, the fact that it's in a completely new space with people who speak a different way offers an air of like freshness. It's like a fresh twist on an old thing.
We should say, you mentioned the Netflix the Netflix seasons. This is important context because the original show only lasted 2 seasons, and then Netflix was like, we're going to bring this back. What does that have to do with Drake, first of all? Can someone explain that to me?
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think that was Netflix necessarily making that decision.
Yeah.
The story, as I understand it, is that Drake was one of the fans of those first 2 seasons that were produced in the UK.
Yeah.
And would always kind of post about it on social media and posted that this show needs to return. 2 seasons isn't enough. And one of the actors in the show, Ashley Walters, who plays Duchesne, reached out to him and connected him with the original creator of the show. One thing led to another, and they ended up at Netflix, and Netflix acquired the show and agreed to produce new seasons.
Just one of the many reasons we have Drake, to thank for something new. Every day, it's something new.
Well, it's a good example of using his power and his influence for something that's for the culture, so to speak.
Wow.
Yeah.
Giving Drake a lot of credit this morning. You know what? Love to see it. Love to see it. I want to play a clip from the final season now. This is an exchange between 2 main characters, between Sully and Jack. Take a listen.
I know the next time I see you, you're going to decide whether or not I live or die. But Sully, I'm begging you. Please, don't hurt my family.
Jack, don't beg. It's disgusting.
Oof, just shudders. I'm a little intimidated just listening to that.
You should be.
That is a moment from the final season of Top Boy that's airing right now on Netflix. The show has had no shortage of really compelling characters. People talk about Duchesne, people talk about Sully, then there's more recent fan favorites, people like Jack and Jamie. Who's your favorite Top Boy character?
That's a tough one because ultimately, if you root for the Sullys or the Duchesnes of the world, you're rooting for the anti-hero, and these are monsters essentially, right? They're doing terrible things. They all have their own individual motivations. But I think one of the characters that kind of really stood out for me and really kind of spoke to what is one of the central themes of the show is Jack, who was in that clip that you just played. She kind of has. There's a real evolution in her character, and she kind of comes to realize that this thing that she's been doing is bad for her and her own soul and her as a person, and bad for the community. And she's trying to get out and make some very kind of like what could be considered stupid decisions in the course of trying to do that.
Yeah. Listen, you mentioned a bunch of the shows that we consider to be, the foundations of this genre. Shows like The Wire, shows like Snowfall, this 50 Cent's show Power. These are all, crime dramas focused on the complicated relationship between black people and the illegal drug trade. Top Boy's coming to an end now. Where do you see it sitting among those? Where do you see it sitting in that conversation?
That's a tricky one to say because I love all of those shows for different reasons. I would say that there's a demarcation between The Wire, which is really that's the gold standard for these shows, I think, and Snowfall and also Top Boy do a good job of kind of like trying to give you a really gritty, action, tension-filled show that also kind of speaks to social commentary and really larger themes about why these worlds are the way they are. Whereas Power, it's kind of like, it's not really rooted in reality so much, but it's a really fun watch. So I would say that Top Boy is in the middle, but they're all kind of closely packed together. So it's like very close to Snowfall and The Wire. But, because it's kind of like repeating a lot of the same story tropes that we've seen in those shows, I can't really put it above those. But it's a really good watch, and it's a really interesting take on where the UK is now. Like, they speak to a lot of things around immigration and just, economic kind of disparity and what the consequences of those forces are.
That makes it not one, but 2 sources I trust saying I should watch Top Boy. You and Drake. This is good company. Ian Steaman, thank you so much for being here, dude.
Thank you for having me.
Ian Steaman is a former music exec turned screenwriter and culture critic. And listen, I really am going to take him up on that. My intention is to watch the entirety of Top Boy sometime in the next couple of weeks. How bad can it be? Well, it'll take me, 10 days? That's fine. The final season of Top Boy is out now on Netflix. And that is it for the show today. Remember, you can listen to Commotion anytime you like, live or on demand. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. You bet I'm going to be here tomorrow. I hope that you're going to be here so we can hang out again. See you then.